There are people who work harder than you and somehow have more energy. Don't cut me off. There are people carrying as many responsibilities as you and still somehow they laugh. They still dream, they still create, they still seem fully alive. And then there are people who are doing almost everything right and still wake up every morning exhausted. Not because they stayed up too late, not because they lack discipline. It ain't got nothing to do with laziness. In fact, if we're honest, the people that are often the most exhausted are the most responsible. They're the ones that show up, the ones that keep their word, who carry everyone else's burden, the ones who do what needs to be done even when they don't feel like it. The dependable ones, the reliable ones, the strong ones. By the way, if you're new here, I'm Aaron, and I help you change the way you see yourself so that you can stop surviving life emotionally and actually start living it. That sounds good to you? Hit that subscribe button, you're in the right place. So maybe that's you, and from the outside, people admire you. People trust you and they depend on you. You handle problems without complaining, you keep it moving. You keep producing, you keep showing up, and because of that, everyone assumes that you're okay. Maybe you're even convinced yourself that you're doing okay. But then there's those quiet moments. The drive home after work. The silence before you fall asleep. The weekend off that don't really feel restful. The vacation that helps for a few days before the heaviness returns. Isn't it strange how you can be physically rested and emotionally exhausted all at the same time? Isn't it crazy how you can sleep 8 hours and still wake up tired? You can take time off and still feel like something inside of you never actually recovered. Most people blame their schedule. I just need more time. I need more balance. I need more boundaries. I need another vacation. I need to feel less busy. And while those things matter, I don't think they fully explain what so many are experiencing. Because if exhaustion were only about what you do, then the busiest people would be the most exhausted. But that's not always what you see. In fact, some people carry heavy responsibility and still seem light, while others carry far less but still feel crushed under the weight of life. So maybe we're asking the wrong question, YouTube. Maybe the question isn't, what am I doing to make myself tired? Perhaps the question is, what am I carrying? Imagine two people walking the same path. Same distance, same weather, same pace. One is carrying an empty backpack. The other is carrying a backpack full of rocks. From a distance, they look identical. They're taking the same steps and they're moving at the same speed. Looks like they're doing the same work. But the truth is they're having two completely different experiences. Not because one person is weaker, but because one person is carrying more weight. Now here's the question that we're going to wrestle with today. What if that's exactly what's happening in your life? What if your exhaustion isn't coming from everything you do? What if it's coming from everything that you're carrying? Not physical weight, the invisible weight. For somebody, it's the weight of disappointment that you never talked about. For someone else, it's the weight of expectations that you've been trying years to meet. Maybe for you, it's the weight of a rejection that changed the way that you view yourself. Maybe for you, it's the weight of always feeling like you have to prove your worth every morning. None of these things show up on your calendar. None of them appear on a to-do list. You can't see them. But every single one of them costs energy because emotional weight still requires emotional strength. And here's what I think we have misunderstood. I don't believe the heaviest thing people carry is their workload. I think it's the version of themselves that they became while trying to survive all they've been going through. Think about that. There's a version of you that learned to be quiet because speaking up wasn't it. It wasn't safe. There's a version of you that learned to prove itself because you felt like you weren't enough. There's a version of you that learned to expect disappointment. That way you won't be surprised when it happens. And maybe those versions protected you. Maybe they helped you survive. Maybe they were exactly what you needed in that season. But what if you're still carrying them? What if you're still dragging old versions of yourself into new seasons of life? What if the person who learned to survive is quietly becoming the person who's just trying to live? Those are not the same person. In fact, the version of you that survives is focused on protection, while the version of you that truly lives is focused on becoming. One is constantly looking over its shoulder, and one is looking towards the future. One is trying not to lose, and the other is trying to grow. And I wonder how many people have confused surviving with living for so long, they don't even recognize the difference anymore. Because here's the tragedy. You can become so accustomed to carrying the emotional weight that it starts to feel like a part of who you are. It's a part of your makeup. Not something you carry, something you are. And that's when exhaustion changes. You're no longer tired because of your schedule. You're tired because every day you're asking a version of yourself, one that was built for survival, to carry the weight of a life that is now calling you to be something more. And with that, I'm going to introduce you to Zach. Zach didn't think he had an exhaustion problem. If you asked him, he would have told you he was just busy. Life was demanding, work was demanding, responsibilities were demanded. I mean, this is what adults do, right? They carry things, they handle things, they figure things out. So when exhaustion showed up, Zach just explained it away. We good. And maybe you do the same. It's just a busy season. I've got a lot going on. Things will calm down eventually. But for Zach, eventually never came. Because the exhaustion wasn't coming from the season. It was actually coming from something much deeper. But to understand what happened, you would have to meet younger Zach, the version that existed before survival entered the chat. Young Zach believed almost anything was possible. He wasn't constantly analyzing risks. He didn't need certainty before taking action. And considering the fact that he was young, he wasn't carrying years of disappointment, rejection, pressure, and responsibility. And that's not just Zach, that's you. You remember that version of you, right? The person you were before life taught you what it could take away. Before you learned how painful failure could feel. Before rejection made you build walls. Before disappointment made you lower your expectation. Before responsibility became heavier than possibility. See, that's the version of themselves that many forget. They allow him or her to fade in the background. And that's why we're starting here. Because if we're going to understand what survival mode does to a person, we first need to remember who they were before they entered it. So Zach used to dream differently. He wasn't obsessed with guarantees. He wasn't constantly asking, what if this doesn't work? He wasn't constantly focused on protecting himself. He was focused on becoming himself. That's a completely different way to live. And so Zach is just going along his merry little way, and then life happened. Not dramatically, but gradually. And this is how identity shifts happen. You see, nobody wakes up in the morning and decides to stop believing in themselves. Nobody consciously chooses to shrink their vision. Nobody intentionally abandons possibility. It happens slowly. A disappointment here, a little setback there. A betrayal you didn't see coming. A dream that didn't work out. A season where you gave everything you had and still came up short. Somebody feels. But here's what many miss. The events themselves aren't what changes you. It is the meaning you attach to them. That's where real transformation happens, or real distortion. Because life doesn't just happen to us, we interpret it. And our interpretations eventually become our identities. Think about that. Two people can experience the exact same failure. One claims that he failed. The other claims that he is a failure. Same event, different identities. One person experiences rejection and concludes, that relationship wasn't right for me. The other one experiences the same type of rejection and thinks, well, I guess I'm just hard to love. Different identity. And identity is where everything changes. Because once something has become a part of our identity, we stop questioning it. We stop evaluating it. We don't examine it. We simply live it. And that's what started happening to Zach. As he grew older, without realizing it, he began collecting conclusions. Not memories, conclusions. Painful, heavy, limiting conclusions. And each one became another rock in his backpack. He failed at an opportunity and he picked up the I'm not capable rock, threw it in his backpack. The rejection came and he picked up the maybe I'm not enough rock and threw it in his backpack. The criticism came and he said, oh, hey, look, it's the maybe I should make myself smaller rock. Let me throw that in the backpack. The disappointment came. Hey, there's one that says maybe I shouldn't get my hopes up. Let me throw that in the backpack. The betrayal came and he finds one that says trusting people is dangerous. Let me throw that in my backpack. And one by one, rock by rock, year by year, the weight became not just something that he carried, it became the lens through which he saw himself. And that's the part I think many miss. Pain rarely enters your future through memory. It enters through identity. You don't keep reliving the event. You keep rehearsing the person that event told you to become. I think I'll say that again. You don't relive the event. You continually rehearse the person that event convinced you to become. That's why some people remain exhausted years after the pain has passed. Because the event ended, but the identity remained. The rejection ended, the insecurity stayed. The failure ended, the self-doubt stayed. The criticism ended, but your need to prove yourself stayed. And here's the thing, expanders. Every one of those identities require energy to maintain. Think about the person who constantly feels like they have something to prove. That's exhausting. The person who never believes that they're enough. That's exhausting. The person who feels responsible for everyone else's happiness. That's exhausting. The person that can never relax because they're afraid of making mistakes. That's exhausting. And it's not because life is demanding, but because identities are demanding. They require constant vigilance, constant protection, constant performance, and constant effort. And years after carrying them, our friend Zach became something that he never intended to become. Not weaker, not broken, just smaller, more cautious, more guarded, more concerned with avoiding pain than pursuing possibility. And that's when something finally started to make sense. The exhaustion wasn't coming from everything he was doing. It was coming from the person he had become while trying to survive. A person who was never meant to carry a future. A person who was only meant to carry him through a season. And when Zach realized that, a much bigger question emerged. If this identity wasn't who he truly was, then who had he become? And perhaps more importantly, who could he become if he only made a decision to put the backpack down? I want to share something with you that completely changed the way I think about people. For years, I thought behavior was a problem. These people ain't built right. Look at how they acted. You ever see an adult and just know that their parents didn't believe in spare the rod, spoil the child? These people are lazy. They don't have any discipline. And for years, I arrogantly and incorrectly thought that behavior was the problem. If someone procrastinated, the problem was procrastination. If someone constantly sought approval, their problem is insecurity. If someone overworked themselves, well, their problem is just poor boundaries. If someone struggles with confidence, the problem is a lack of confidence. And if we're being honest, because this is the honesty table, that's how most of us think. We see a behavior and we try to fix the behavior. But as I'm growing, I'm realizing that behavior is rarely the problem. Behavior is the fruit. The real problem's underneath. Think about a tree. If the leaves start turning brown, you don't tape green leaves onto its branches. You don't paint the fruit. You don't decorate the outside. You go underground. You examine the roots. There must be something wrong here because Healthy roots produce healthy fruits, and an unhealthy root will eventually produce unhealthy fruit. Our lives work the same way. Our action is the fruit. Our identity is the root. This is why changing behavior without changing identity rarely lasts. It can't last. You can force yourself to act differently for a while. You can use discipline, motivation, willpower, but eventually you will always find yourself back to the person that you believe that you are, because identity always wins. It's undefeated. And Zach didn't realize that's exactly what had happened to him. He kept trying to change what he did without ever looking at who he had become. He wanted more confidence, but deep down he still believed he wasn't enough. He wanted more peace, but he had built an identity around preparing for disappointment. He wanted healthier relationships, but he still lived as the person that always expected people to leave. He wanted freedom, but he was making decisions from a place of survival. Do you feel the tension? His future wanted one thing, his identity wanted another. And identity always wins, because your identity is constantly asking the question, what kind of person am I? Then it quietly goes to work behind the scenes to ensure that you walk out that person. It goes behind the scenes to ensure that your life is consistent with your answer. If you believe you're the kind of person that struggles, you'll unconsciously find evidence to support it and won't have to look long. If you believe you're the type of person that has to earn love, you'll spend your whole life performing for acceptance. Pick me. If you believe that you're the strong one, you may never ask for help, even though you're drowning. And if you believe that your value comes from what you produce, you'll feel guilty every time you rest. The behavior changes, yes, but the identity underneath remains the same. And that's why many can never truly relax. Not because they don't have free time, but because rest threatens the identity that we've built. If my worth comes from producing, then slowing down feels dangerous. Some people can never say no, not because they're kind, but because somewhere in their story they learned that love had to be earned. Some people refuse to trust anyone, not because they're wise, but because pain has convinced them that vulnerability is no longer safe. Notice something? Every one of those behaviors started as protection. None of them began as a prison. You see, the people pleaser wasn't born trying to please people. At some point, pleasing people kept them safe. The perfectionist wasn't born afraid of making mistakes. At some point, perfection became protection. The overachiever wasn't born believing that success determined worth. At some point, achievement became the place that they searched for acceptance. And the emotionally distant person wasn't born disconnected. At some point, distance felt safer than disappointment. And those identities, they didn't appear overnight. They were inherited. Inherited from pain, inherited from fear, inherited from experiences that quietly whispered, hey, this is who you have to become if you want to survive. And because those identities, they protect us, we rarely question them. In fact, we defend them. We fight for our limitations, and those that fight for our limitations get to keep them. We justify them. We call them our personality. We say, I'm just wired this way. But are you? Are you wired that way? Or are you describing a survival strategy that you've rehearsed so long that it feels like your personality? That's a different question. And the good news is, if it's learned, it can be unlearned. If it was built, it can be rebuilt. And if it became your identity, it doesn't necessarily have to remain your identity. That was Zach's breakthrough. For years, he thought he was discovering who he was, when in reality, he was protecting who survival required him to be. And the person he was becoming wasn't false. He had really become that person. But it wasn't the deepest truth about him. And it wasn't the person he wanted to remain. It wasn't the person his future required. And that's the danger of living from a survival identity. You eventually mistake adaptation with authenticity. You assume the version of you that learned to survive is the version of you that you were always meant to be. But what if it isn't? What if underneath the fear, underneath the striving, the proving, and the perfectionism, underneath the constant need to hold everything together, still another version of you that is waiting to emerge? A version that doesn't have to earn worth. A version that doesn't have to prove value. A version that doesn't have to carry yesterday into tomorrow. A version of you that's no longer living from survival, but purpose. Because I don't think that your greatest obstacle is your past. I think it's the identity that your past quietly handed you. And here's the beautiful news. You ready? Just because you inherited an identity doesn't mean that you have to keep living from it. But before you can become someone new, there's something you have to understand about the version of yourself that got you here. Because if you don't understand why that version exists, you'll spend your entire life trying to destroy the very person who was only trying to protect you. And that just might be the greatest mistake we make in personal growth. When Zach finally began seeing the identity he built, his reaction wasn't relief, it was actually frustration. He started noticing all the ways that survival had shaped him. The overthinking, the constant need to prove himself, the pressure he put on himself to never fail, the way he struggled to rest without feeling guilty, the way he carried everyone else's burdens while quietly ignoring his own. At first, he was angry. He wanted those parts of himself gone. He wanted to stop overthinking, to stop worrying and striving, to stop carrying the weight. He looked at those parts of himself like they were defects. They were the enemies. They were the reason he couldn't move forward. Maybe you're doing the same thing. Maybe you looked in the mirror and thought, why am I like this? Why can't I just move on? Why can't I stop overthinking? Why do I always assume the worst? Why do I keep sabotaging myself? Those questions sound honest, but inside them is hidden an accusation. They assume something is wrong with you. Zach believed that too, until one realization had changed everything. The version of himself that he was trying to get rid of was the same version of himself that helped him survive. What? The version I'm trying to destroy is a version that once protected me? And suddenly, everything looked different. The overthinking, maybe it wasn't a weakness. Maybe it was the mind of someone who learned that mistakes have consequences. The perfectionism, it wasn't an obsession. Maybe it was developed in an environment where failure felt unsafe. And the people pleasing, maybe it wasn't a lack of boundaries. Maybe it was a child that discovered that keeping everyone happy kept the peace. Maybe these emotional walls weren't coldness, but armor. Do you see what changed? Zach stopped asking what's wrong with me and started asking what happened that made this version of me necessary. And that question changed everything because it replaced condemnation with curiosity. And curiosity is where healing can begin. Think about someone who breaks their leg. You wouldn't criticize them for crutches. You wouldn't tell them they're weak because they couldn't walk normally. You would understand that the crutches are serving a purpose. And no, the crutches, they're not the destination, but they're support for a season. And survival identities work the same way. They're emotional crutches, not because you're weak, but because at one point you genuinely needed them. And before you jump all over those past identities, realize that those identities were there to solve a problem. And because they solved a problem, that's what makes them so difficult to release. Because your mind doesn't see them as burdens. It doesn't see them as rocks in your backpack. It sees them as protection. And that's what survival does. It convinces you that what kept you alive must keep leading your life. But here's the tragedy. The very thing that once protected you can now prevent you from becoming who you were meant to be. The armor that saved you in battle will become unbearingly heavy if you insist on wearing it throughout the rest of your life. Imagine a soldier returns home years after a war. Every sound makes them alert. Every room gets scanned. Every unfamiliar face looks like a potential threat. On the battlefield, those instincts keep you alive. At home, the very same instincts keep you from living. The environment changed. The identity didn't. And I wonder just how many of us are doing exactly that. Still fighting battles that ended years ago. Still expecting rejection before it arrives. Still preparing for disappointment before anything has gone wrong. Still proving ourselves to those whose opinions no longer define us. Still carrying the armor that no longer fits the life that we are building. No wonder you're exhausted. It's exhausting to wear that armor every single day. It's exhausting to stay emotionally guarded. It's exhausting to constantly monitor every conversation, every decision, every possibility, every relationship. Because survival requires vigilance, while living requires trust. And Zach finally realized something that set him free. His survival identity wasn't the enemy, it had been his protector. And for the first time in years, instead of resenting that version of himself, he felt compassion for it. And he could finally say, thank you. Thank you for getting me through. Thank you for helping me survive. Thank you for protecting me when I didn't know how to protect myself. But it's a new season now, and it's different now, and you are relieved of your duties. I don't need to carry you into my future. It's one of the hardest conversations you'll ever have, and it's not even with another person, it's with yourself. Because every single person watching this has a version of themselves that deserves gratitude. The version that endured. The version that kept showing up. The version that carried so much more than anyone ever knew. Man, I've been there. The version that made it through seasons that you thought you'd never survive. Honor that person. Don't hate them. Don't shame them. Don't pretend like they never existed. They got you here. But don't confuse honoring them with handing them the key to your future. Because the version of you that was built to survive yesterday cannot become the version of you that is called to build tomorrow. And at some point, gratitude must give way to growth. At some point, compassion must give way to courage. Survival must make room for becoming. Because there's another version of you waiting. No, it's not perfect. No, it's not fearless. But it's freer. It's lighter. It's a version of you that believes that life is no longer something to endure, but it's something to create. And becoming that person doesn't begin by trying harder. It begins by laying down the armor that you no longer need. And that's what Zach would learn next. After everything that Zach had discovered, he expected the next step to be complicated. He thought it would require some secret, some breakthrough, some perfect strategy that would erase the years of emotional weight. Instead, the next lesson was surprisingly simple. He didn't need to become someone. He needed to stop carrying someone he no longer had to be. That's the difference. Because personal growth often gives you the impression that transformation is about adding more habits, more discipline, more routines. But what if transformation isn't always about addition? What if sometimes it's about release? Think about a sculptor standing in front of a block of marble. They don't build the masterpiece by adding to the stone. They reveal it by chipping away everything that doesn't belong. The masterpiece was never manufactured, it was uncovered. And I wonder if that's how identity works. Maybe the person you're becoming isn't someone that you're building from scratch. Maybe there's someone that's been underneath the survival identity all along. Not hidden because they disappeared, but hidden because they've been buried. Zach had spent years trying to improve the survival version of himself. But eventually he realized that the goal wasn't to build a stronger survival identity. The goal was to stop living from one. That's a profound difference. Because if survival is your identity, everything becomes about protection. Choosing careers that feel safe instead of meaningful. Staying in relationships that are familiar instead of healthy. Avoiding conversations that could bring you freedom because they also can bring you a little discomfort. And what's crazy is we begin to measure success by how little pain we experience instead of how much we've grown. And without realizing it, your world gets smaller. Not because your potential shrank, because your identity did. Survival has a funny way of convincing you that the safest goal is the highest goal. But growth has never been safe. In fact, Every meaningful chapter of your life required uncertainty. Every season that stretched you, it required discomfort. Every breakthrough demanded that the old version be left behind. And the irony in this is the very thing your survival fears is often the place where your future begins. And Zach began noticing that all the opportunities that he had avoided had one thing in common. They required him to stop acting like the person he had been. And at first that felt terrifying, because whenever you stop living from an old identity, you feel like you're losing a part of yourself. It feels like you're losing yourself, but you're not. You're losing the version of yourself that pain introduced. And you're making room for the version of yourself that purpose has been calling. That's why becoming often feels uncomfortable. Not because you're becoming someone fake, because you're becoming someone unfamiliar. Becoming requires retraining your identity, not through positive thinking. I love positive thinking, but it's through repeated evidence. It's through making decisions that cast a vote towards your new identity. And it's not one choice that transforms a life, but thousands of choices end up transforming a person, and a transformed person lives a transformed life. That's the order. It's not life first, it's identity first. Because your life will eventually become consistent with a person that you believe yourself to be. And that's why this conversation was never really about exhaustion. Exhaustion was simply the symptom. The deeper issue was identity. The version of Zach that was exhausted, he wasn't exhausted because he worked too hard. He was exhausted because every day he woke up and asked the survival identity to carry the weight of a life it was never designed to lead. And that brings us to a question that every one of us is eventually going to have to answer. If the backpack can come off, if their armor no longer has to stay on, if the survival identity no longer has to lead, then who are you? Really? Because your answer will determine your direction for the rest of your life. I want to leave you with this final picture. Imagine that every person begins life carrying an empty backpack. As a child, it's light and you move freely. You dream without hesitation. You trust easily. You imagine endlessly. You don't spend your days wondering if you're enough. You don't wake up thinking about proving your value. You simply live. And then life begins adding weight. Disappointment rock, rejection rock, betrayal rock, failure rock, harsh words that stay with you longer than it should, a season where you feel invisible, a relationship that taught you to be guarded. And one by one, the backpack gets heavier. But here's the part that most people never notice. The rocks aren't what change you. It's how you begin carrying them. At first, you simply have pain, and then pain begins making suggestions. Be careful. Don't trust so easily. Don't dream too big. Don't let people get too close. Don't fail again. And those suggestions become beliefs. Those beliefs become habits, and those habits become identities. And eventually you're no longer carrying the backpack that you think you're carrying. In fact, you think you are the backpack. This is your whole life. And you forget there was ever a version underneath it. And that's what happened to Zach. For years, he believed he was the anxious one. Overthinker, perfectionist, the one who had to always have everything under control, the one who couldn't slow down, the one who had to earn his worth. And then one day he realized that those weren't the deepest truths about himself. They were adaptations, yes. They were survival strategies, yes. They were responses, but they were never meant to become his identity. And I wonder how many of you out there in YouTube land need to hear the same thing. Maybe you're not naturally cynical. Maybe you've just been disappointed enough times that hope feels dangerous. Maybe you're not naturally controlling. Maybe control became the only way that you knew how to feel safe. Maybe you're not naturally distant. Maybe distance has just become easier than vulnerability. Maybe you're not naturally driven by achievement. Maybe achievement has become the place that you look for acceptance that you've never felt. Do you see the difference? When you believe those things are your identity, you stop believing that change is possible, because identities feel permanent. But if they're adaptations, they're also invitations. Invitations to become again. That's why I don't believe that the goal of personal growth is becoming someone completely different. I think it's remembering. Remembering who you were before fear taught you to shrink. Remembering that underneath every survival strategy, there's still a person capable of living fully, not because they've never been hurt, but because they no longer allow hurt to define who they are. And I want you to hear me. Transformation is deciding that pain may have influenced your story, but it will no longer author your identity. It's deciding that your past can be a chapter, but it can't be a narrator. And when you reach that moment, your life is no longer looked through the lens of survival, but it's being experienced through the lens of becoming. And that's the invitation I want to leave you with today. Not to work harder, to become more productive, to fix yourself. But I think you've been carrying someone for a very long time. Someone who deserved compassion and gratitude. Someone who got you through seasons that you thought you'd never survive. Honor them. Thank them. Because without them, you might not be here today. But don't you dare ask them to build your future. They weren't created for that. And at some point, you have to put the backpack down. Not because the journey is over, but because at some point you become strong enough to stop carrying what no longer belongs to you. And here's what I believe. It won't be your workload. It won't even be your past. The greatest weight you'll ever lay down will be the identity that you adopted just to survive it. And the moment you do, you'll notice something beautiful. You were never too exhausted to live. You were simply carrying someone that you were never meant to be forever. So don't spend the rest of your life becoming better at surviving. Become the person who is finally free enough to live. Always remember that growth is a journey, it's not a destination. I'm in it with you, and I'll see you on the next one.